Guilt has a way of showing up right when you start to change. Not at the beginning, but right when you begin to choose differently. When you say no, when you stop overextending, when you start honoring yourself in ways that you didn't before. And suddenly, it feels like you've done something wrong.
Welcome to Reclaiming Me, a trauma-informed podcast helping women with complex PTSD heal the lasting impact of childhood attachment wounds from parents and caregivers, so you can finally release people-pleasing and perfectionism and learn to trust in relationships, beginning with the one you have with yourself. I'm your host, Cindy Payne, therapist, trauma specialist, and a woman who has walked this path both personally and professionally.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this mini midweek reframe episode. And today I'm going to be touching on what it is like to carry guilt and maybe even some hidden shame through these identity shifts that we talked about in our fawning episode on Monday. We talked about these identity shifts, especially through the lens of complex trauma. And today we are really going to hone in on something that comes with those shifts, whether we recognize it or not, and that is the guilt and the shame. When you've spent years fawning, people-pleasing, or orienting yourself around others, changing that pattern can be very uncomfortable at first. But more than that, it can feel wrong in a lot of ways. And that's not because it is wrong, but it's because it's unfamiliar and it comes with some old wounds and some old narratives around those wounds. So I want to talk about the survival alarm that happens when you start to make these changes when it comes to your identity. In the full episode on Monday, we talked about Gabor Mate's idea that children will always choose attachment over authenticity to stay safe. So if you grew up in an environment where being yourself was dangerous, your brain learned to use guilt and maybe even shame messages as an early warning system. So when you start to choose authenticity now as an adult, that old survival system screams, wait, if you do what you want and what is best for you, you might lose the connection or you might be cast out. And that scream is what we experience as what I want to call unearned guilt. It is not a sign that you are a bad person. It's a sign that your brain is trying to protect a version of you that just simply does not exist anymore. Guilt can be a learned emotional response. And guilt might have helped you stay connected in the past and avoid conflict or maybe even maintain a sense of safety. So when you begin to shift that identity and operate from your core values, that guilt doesn't just go away. That guilt follows you. But here is an important reframe. Guilt does not always mean that you've done something wrong. Sometimes it means that you've done something different. And this is where we begin to shift our internal narrative. So instead of, I should have done more or I shouldn't have changed, what we want to do is we want to move forward and towards this idea of I did the best that I could with what I had at the time, and I am doing my best with the tools that I have now. And this brings us back to the self-discontinuity that I mentioned in Monday's full-length episode. So when you feel that gap between who you were, maybe the fawner, and who you are currently, the person that is setting boundaries, guilt and sometimes even shame fills the gap. But by saying I am doing my best, what this does is it actually allows you to acknowledge that you are no longer in survival mode. You are giving yourself permission to be a work in progress rather than a finished product that must be perfect to be loved. And that statement really can help bring you back into context, not judgment. And from there, we can begin to separate guilt from shame. So if you've listened to previous episodes, you might have heard me talk about the main difference between guilt and shame. And early on in my own work, this was pivotal for me to understand the difference. And it turns out I had been carrying a lifetime of shame that was showing up as what I thought was guilt. And with the work of mainly Brene Brown, she's the pioneer for shame and guilt research, I learned to distinguish the difference. And so guilt says I did something wrong, and shame says I am something wrong. So that's a pretty big difference, because what happens in the body is when we experience guilt and shame is it registers in our nervous system as a threat. And so we will typically respond from a place of protection when we are experiencing guilt and shame. And sometimes that looks like fight. Sometimes it looks like flight. Sometimes it's the freeze response, and sometimes it's the fawning response. And many people carry both guilt and shame, even when neither is actually true in the present moment. And I will be doing some future episodes on guilt and shame, but I do want to say this, that I personally believe that there is no healthy amount of shame ever. That shame really loves secrecy and silence and judgment. And that is what fuels addiction. It is what fuels dysfunctional relationships. It is what fuels suicidal ideation, self-harm, right? Because it's a person's belief that they are fundamentally flawed. Much like unearned guilt. That is really similar, right? It's guilt that you're carrying when you are not responsible for that action that brought the guilt upon you. So there is healthy guilt to some degree that allows us to repair when there's been a rupture, but that's not the kind of guilt that I'm referring to in this episode. What I'm referring to is the unearned guilt and then the shame that follows. So just know that if guilt and maybe even some shame is showing up as you move through an identity shift, see if you can pause and ask yourself, is this guilt about harm, or is this guilt about change? And that's a really crucial set of questions there. The Ingrid Clayton connection that I want to make is that in her book, Fawning, she reminds us that the goal isn't to never feel guilt, but rather the goal is to stop letting guilt and shame dictate our identity. So you can actually feel the guilt, acknowledge that it's an old survival tool, and still choose to do the new thing anyway. And can you meet yourself with a little more understanding as you grow? Because this shift isn't just about changing what you do, but it's about finally becoming safe enough to be who you are. So my invitation for you is to take that permission with you into the rest of your week. And if you start to feel flooded with guilt or shame, or perhaps both, you can go back to those questions. Is this guilt about harm, or is it about change? And hopefully that'll allow you to pivot and keep moving in the direction of growth and honesty and inner harmony. So I hope you join me back next Monday for another full-length episode. And until then, be good to yourself and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you for spending this time with me today. I hope you leave feeling a little lighter, a little more grounded, and a little closer to trusting yourself and your inner experience. If this episode resonated with you, please follow or subscribe so future conversations can meet you when they're needed. And if someone came to mind while you were listening, consider sharing this episode with them. That's one of the ways this work reaches the people who need it the most. You can find me on Instagram at Cindy Payne Rooted, and you can also visit me at cindypayne.com, where you'll find all episode links, blog posts, practice updates, and a free people-pleasing style quiz designed to help you notice your patterns with more compassion. And remember, every small step towards healing, self-trust, and presence matters. You are worthy of this journey. Thanks, everyone.